The smell of reheated soup filled the tiny kitchen, its faint warmth doing little to cut through the chill of the evening. Mary sat at the cluttered table, her schoolbooks spread in a disorganized sprawl. The dim light from the lone bulb overhead cast shadows across the pages of her worn algebra textbook, her pencil trembling slightly in her hand. She stared at the same equation for the third time, the numbers blurring together. In the adjoining room, her parents' voices cut through her concentration. "I'm telling you, we can't afford this anymore," her mother snapped, her voice high and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. "And what do you want me to do about it?" her father shot back, his tone laced with equal parts guilt and frustration. "I can't exactly get a job with this knee." Mary flinched as her father banged his fist on the table, making the rickety old structure groan. She tried to block out the noise, pressing the eraser of her pencil against her temple as if that might drive the problem out of her head. "Mary!" Her mother's voice startled her, and she turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, her face etched with exhaustion. The deep lines around her eyes seemed to have carved themselves deeper in recent weeks. "We need to talk." Mary's stomach sank. She knew that tone. Carefully closing her textbook, she met her mother's gaze. "We've been talking," her mother began, stepping closer. Her father followed, leaning against the doorway with a defeated look. "With everything going on, your father's leg, the bills piling up, it's getting harder." Mary nodded slowly. She could see where this was going, but she stayed silent. "We think it's best if you—" Her mother hesitated, looking down at her hands. "If you take a break from school. Just for now. You can help out at the diner. Mrs. Callahan said she'd take you on." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mary stared at her parents, her throat tightening. School had been her sanctuary, her one escape. I can still study in the evenings," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'll keep up. I can." "Mary," her father interrupted, his voice softer than usual. "This isn't about what you want. It's what we need." Her mother reached out and placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "We wouldn't ask this if there was another way." Mary glanced at her books, her dreams of college, of a life beyond this cramped, noisy kitchen. She wanted to fight back, to argue, but the look in her parents' eyes stopped her. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help." Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "Thank you, sweetheart," as her father turned away, unable to meet her eyes. As the house fell quiet, Mary returned to her seat at the table. She looked at the numbers on the page, but they no longer made sense. Instead, her gaze drifted to her notebook, a plain, dog-eared thing filled with half-finished stories and ideas. Her fingers brushed the cover, and for a fleeting moment, her resolve hardened. She wouldn't give this up, no matter how hard things got. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her textbooks. Tomorrow would bring a new reality, but tonight, she clung to the faint glow of her dreams. The restaurant was loud and chaotic, a whirlwind of clinking plates, shouting orders, and the hum of conversation. Mary stood at the counter, tying her apron with trembling fingers. The smell of fried food mingled with coffee hung in the air, and she felt her nerves tighten with every sound. "Mary! Table 5 needs water, and grab those orders for Table 2. Mrs. Callahan, the diner's owner, barked over the din. She was a stout woman with a sharp voice, but her eyes softened whenever she glanced at Mary. "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, grabbing a tray and balancing the weight as best as she could. Her first shift was a blur of activity, dropping off plates, cleaning tables, refilling drinks, all while dodging bustling cooks and impatient customers. By the time her break arrived, Mary's feet ached, and her arms felt like lead. She slumped into a chair near the kitchen door, closing her eyes for a moment. "First day's always rough," came a voice. She opened her eyes to see an elderly man sitting at a nearby table, a crossword puzzle in front of him. He offered her a kind smile. "But you'll get the hang of it." Mary managed a small smile back. "Thanks. It's a lot to take in." The man gestured to his crossword. "You good with words? I'm stuck on a 5-letter one for dreams." She thought for a moment, then said, "Aspire." He grinned. "Perfect. You've got a sharp mind, young lady. Don't let this place dull it." Mary didn't reply, but his words lingered as she returned to work. The library became Mary's sanctuary. After long shifts at the diner, she'd head straight there, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floors. The public library was quiet, its air cool and still. Mary loved the smell of old pages mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the librarian's desk. She made her way to her favorite corner, where shelves of fiction towered over a cozy reading nook. She pulled down a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and sank into the armchair. The words on the pages were like a balm, transporting her far from the clatter of the diner and the weight of her family's struggles. Mary began carrying a small notebook with her, jotting down phrases and observations that came to her while reading. A description of a rainy street, a snippet of dialogue overheard at work, it all went into her notebook. One evening, as she flipped through a collection of essays, she came across an announcement pinned to the bulletin board. "Local Writing Club, Tuesdays at 6 p.m. All levels welcome." Her heart quickened. Could she join? Would they even take her seriously? She stared at the flyer, biting her lip, before carefully tearing off one of the contact slips at the bottom. The community center smelled of dust and old wood. Mary clutched her notebook tightly as she entered the room where the writing club met. A circle of mismatched chairs surrounded a table piled high with notebooks, pens, and coffee cups. "Hi there!" A cheerful woman with short curly hair waved her over. "You must be new." I'm Mary," she said shyly, taking a seat. The other members greeted her warmly, and she began to relax. The session started with everyone sharing something they'd written. Mary listened intently as poems, short stories, and essays filled the air, each voice unique. When it was her turn, her hands trembled as she opened her notebook. "This is, a story I wrote about my first day at work," she stammered. Her voice quavered as she began reading, but as the words flowed, she felt her confidence grow. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before and spoke. "That was wonderful, Mary. Honest and vivid. You've got a real talent." Another member chimed in. "You should submit that somewhere. There are plenty of magazines that'd love something like that." Mary's cheeks flushed with pride and disbelief. She'd never considered her writing good enough to share, let alone publish. As the meeting ended, Anne handed her a list of literary magazines and said, "Start small. You'll be surprised what happens when you take a chance." Mary clutched the list and her notebook tightly, a seed of hope taking root in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the cusp of something bigger than herself. Mary sat cross-legged on her bed, a stack of envelopes spread out before her. Most were thin and impersonal, containing little more than a form rejection. She had grown used to the sting, though each one still left a faint ache in her chest. Her mother's voice drifted in from the kitchen. "Anything good in the mail, sweetheart?" Mary hesitated, staring at the latest envelope. "Not yet," she called back. But her fingers lingered on the pile, and she couldn't help hoping each time she opened one. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, she noticed an envelope that felt different. Her name was neatly typed on the front, and the return address belonged to a local literary magazine. With trembling hands, she tore it open. The first line made her gasp. "We are pleased to inform you that your story, The First Day, has been accepted for publication." Her heart raced as she read the rest. The magazine even offered a modest payment. She ran into the kitchen, waving the letter in her hand. "Mom! Dad! Look!" Her parents read the letter, their faces breaking into smiles. Her mother hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Her father taped the letter to the fridge next to her story's draft, a small but meaningful triumph. The holiday rush turned the diner into chaos. Mary barely had time to breathe between running orders and cleaning tables. The pressure weighed on her, and she often stayed late into the night, scrubbing the floors after closing. One evening, a particularly rude customer left her shaken. He complained loudly about the service, insulted her directly, and stormed out without paying. Tears pricked her eyes as she cleaned up the mess he left behind, her hands trembling. She sat down in the break room, burying her face in her hands. For the first time, she wondered if it was all worth it, working herself to exhaustion, struggling to write in the few hours she had left, and facing rejection after rejection. "Rough night?" came a familiar voice. She looked up to see the elderly regular from her first day, his crossword puzzle tucked under one arm. Mary nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm starting to think this is pointless." He sat across from her, setting down his puzzle. "Pointless? You're working hard, making a difference for your family, and chasing your dreams. Sounds like the opposite of pointless to me." His words brought a small, grateful smile to her face. "Thanks," she murmured. "Just remember," he said, standing up, "even on the hardest days, don't let go of what matters most." Mary held on to his advice as she finished her shift. Later that night, she poured her frustration and exhaustion into a new story, her pen moving furiously across the page. The writing club felt like a second home now, and Mary looked forward to each meeting. On a chilly Tuesday evening, the room buzzed with excitement, and had invited a guest speaker, an editor from a prominent literary journal. The editor, a sharply dressed man with a warm demeanor, encouraged everyone to share their work. Mary hesitated, her fingers tightening around her notebook. She had brought a deeply personal story about her family's struggles but wasn't sure if she had the courage to read it. When her turn came, and nudged her gently. "Go on, Mary. You've got this." Taking a deep breath, Mary stood and began to read. Her voice shook at first but grew steadier with each word. The story painted a vivid picture of a family's resilience in the face of hardship, drawing from her own experiences. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. The editor leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "That was extraordinary," he said. "Raw, honest, and deeply moving. I'd like to publish it in our next issue." Mary's heart nearly stopped. Are you serious?" "Absolutely. Stories like yours deserve to be heard," he replied. As the meeting ended, Mary felt a surge of pride and gratitude. For the first time, it felt like her writing had the power to truly connect with others. The seed of hope within her began to blossom. Mary's family huddled around the kitchen table, the latest issue of the literary journal open before them. Her story, titled "The Weight of Hope," was printed on the glossy pages, her name in bold beneath the title. Her mother traced the words with her fingertips, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't believe it! Your name, right there!" Her father, usually stoic, chuckled softly. "It's more than just a name. This is her voice, her life on paper. It's incredible." The phone rang constantly that week as friends, neighbors, and even old teachers called to congratulate her. One local bookstore invited Mary to speak at a small event about her journey and the inspiration behind her story. As Mary stood in front of the modest crowd, clutching the microphone, she spoke from the heart. "This story is about struggle, but it's also about hope. I've learned that no matter how tough life gets, dreams are worth holding on to." Afterward, an agent approached her, handing over his card. "You have a rare gift, Mary. I'd love to help you develop it further. Have you ever thought about writing a book?" The idea had lingered in her mind for years but always seemed out of reach. Now, it felt like a door was opening. She nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I have." The classroom was small and quiet, with only a handful of students attending evening classes. Mary took her seat near the front, feeling both nervous and excited. It had been years since she'd sat in a classroom, but this time was different. She wasn't here out of obligation but out of choice. She wanted to finish her education, not just for herself but as a step towards something bigger. Her days were full, balancing shifts at the diner, writing her novel, and studying for exams. But the exhaustion felt lighter now, buoyed by purpose. One night, as she worked through a stack of assignments, she paused to glance at her notebook. Its pages were now filled with outlines and chapters for her novel, which she had tentatively titled The Sky We Dreamed. She smiled, a quiet determination settling over her. The bookstore was bustling, filled with readers eager to meet the author whose stories had touched their hearts. Mary sat at a small table near the front, a neat stack of books beside her. Her first novel, The Sky We Dreamed, had been published to critical acclaim. Its vivid portrayal of working-class struggles and triumphs resonated with readers far and wide. Mary signed books and chatted with fans, each conversation reinforcing the power of her words to connect with others. A young girl approached, clutching a dog-eared notebook. "I want to be a writer too," the girl said shyly. "Do you think I can do it?" Mary smiled warmly, handing back the signed book. "If you love it and work hard, nothing can stop you. Keep writing, no matter what." At the back of the room, Mary's parents stood together, their pride radiating as they watched their daughter. Her father raised a hand in a small wave, and Mary waved back, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the event wound down, Mary found a quiet moment to herself. She glanced around the room, taking in the faces of readers and supporters. Her journey had been long and challenging, but every moment had led her here. She picked up her pen to sign one last book, a satisfied smile on her lips. Her story was just beginning, and she was ready to write every page.